71st Republic Day. Pakistan-backed anti-India protests have begun outside the Indian High Commission premises in London. Protesters are raising anti-India slogans, and on display are anti-India messages on placards. Protesters have gathered to demonstrate outside the Indian High Commission building. These include students, activists and representatives from several diaspora within the subcontinent and human rights organizations. Government sources have claimed that pro-Pakistani and separatist groups led by the Tehreek-e-Kashmir are leading these protests, goading Indian origin citizens to observe a black day against the Indian government. Indian diplomats and British Indians fear violence and damage to the Indian High Commission building. This is the second rally in less than 24 hours in London. On Saturday, the rally, organized by student groups and Indian outfits in the United Kingdom, marched around a mile down the streets to gather outside the Indian High Commission. On Independence Day last year, protesters in London demonstrated against India's decision to revoke the special status for Jammu and Kashmir. The protests turned to clashes and vandalism outside the embassy. In yet another incident, on the 3rd of September last year, the Indian High Commission building suffered damage again. This will be the fourth major protest in the last year outside the Indian High Commission. Authorities in the UK, despite having heard India's concerns over the scheduled Republic Day protests, have failed to stop them. Even several members of the Indian diaspora wrote to various authorities in the UK to ban these protests. Meanwhile, European Union lawmakers have expressed solidarity with the protesters. Over 150 European Union leaders have drafted a 5-page anti-CAA resolution. They've contended that the citizenship row will create the largest statelessness crisis in the world and cause immense human suffering. Our London Bureau Chief Mandy Clark was at the site of the protests on Republic Day outside the Indian Embassy in London, and she gets us this report from a short while ago. Take a look.
The protesters have gathered outside the India High Commission here in London, but not in the numbers that they had promised. At one point they said there was hundreds of buses that were descending, carrying protesters. There's probably around 50 protesters, so not nearly the numbers that they were promising. The police certainly have made a concerted effort to keep this peaceful protest. There have been police on horseback. They've closed off half the road, only allowing them to protest on the further side of the street, allowing traffic to continue to flow in front of the High Commission, and also there's barriers. So certainly there's no hint of violence, and there's a lot of security parameters in place. It has been a noisy protest, but it certainly hasn't been a violent one. Mandy Clark, World is One, WION, London.
Mandy Clark reporting on our top focus tonight. Even as India celebrates its 71st Republic Day, Pakistan-backed anti-protests have begun in London. Visuals on your screens of the protests on Saturday by student groups. Whereas, even as we speak, there are protests that are taking place outside the Indian High Commission, Indian Embassy in London. Protesters are raising anti-India slogans, and on display are anti-India messages on placards that they are holding up. And these include students, activists and representatives from several diaspora within the subcontinent, as well as human rights organizations. Government sources have claimed that pro-Pakistani and separatist groups led by the Tehreek-e-Kashmir organization are leading these protests. And they are goading Indian origin citizens to observe a so-called Black Day against the Indian government. And these are visuals of a short while ago when protests took place on the streets of London and have culminated outside the Indian Embassy premises. Indian diplomats and British Indians, fearing violence, had complained to UK authorities, but they have failed to ban these protests. We have Dr. Kadira Petiagoda, former visiting fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, joining us live from London. for more on that. Thank you so much for being with us here on the broadcast, Dr. Kadira. I wanted to begin by asking you, Indians in Britain had consistently raised alarm bells over this planned protests on the Republic Day because of what has happened before on every single occasion when there were protests outside the Indian embassy. Still, authorities in the UK failing to contain them, failing to ban them, and now we are running the risk of more violence and vandalism.
Yes, well, I think this goes actually to the really core issue of the division within the Asian community in the UK. So you've got some parts of the Asian population here who are very pro-Indian government, and then there are certain segments that are very critical of the Indian government. That includes both people of Indian origin and Pakistani origin, and these divisions are based on religion, class, income, the time in which they came, and you've even seen these divisions actually play out in UK domestic politics. At the last election, for example, where you saw different groups from the Indian community actively campaigning both for the Conservatives and for Labour.
Dr. Kadira, I wanted to ask you this. Government sources have claimed that these are, pro-Pakistan groups who are organizing these protests, which are led by the Tehreek-e-Kashmir. It's clear that there is propaganda that's written all over these protests.
Yes, it's. I guess the risk with these protests is that they often they can be hijacked by different groups with different agendas that then sort of infiltrate the protests and then seek to, promote their own particular cause. And that's something that, people those who are protesting against the CAA, if they don't want to be associated with that, they'd have to take some particular precautions. But yeah, as you said, I've been at Indian Republic Day and Independence Day celebrations in London before, and there's often, protesting groups with various separatist causes that are often there. So that's always an issue.
Right. I'm asking this specifically because be it the billboards on Times Square in New York or be these protests, there is clear that there is some funding that is going in from Pakistan and from the establishment of Pakistan towards anti-India propaganda at a global level, especially over Kashmir.
Well, I know that, but obviously the two governments are combating each other on this issue at the UN, and then Pakistan was talking about raising a case at the ICJ. It's difficult, I guess, to trace those connections into individual protest movements, because often the connections between a state's intelligence service and other sort of non-state actors, it's very difficult to make those connections. But, I wouldn't be surprised, because great powers and medium powers often use their intelligence services in other countries to connect with various groups and then to promote their foreign policy agenda in that way.
Right. Dr. Kadira, at the end of the day, as we speak, there are protests taking place outside the Indian embassy in London. In terms of the security seems to have been beefed up and roads seem to have been shut down in London. Talk to us about what are the chances that this situation can go away without any harm being caused at this stage?
Yes, well, I think there has been, the Indian High Commission has had communications with the UK government, and they've been very, they've pushed the UK government to provide the adequate protections. And I think that, the British government in place at the moment, the Conservative Party, actually owes a lot to the Indian community, which in large part actually campaigned for them at the last election. So, and I've seen, various copies of letters and emails between the various authorities and the Indian community assuring them of safety. So I guess, we'll really hope that there's no incidents, but we would have to wait and see.
And we've seen, I'm just going to go back again to those previous incidents, be it September 3rd, 2019 or August 15th, 2019. Both of those incidents ended up in vandalism. and ended up these were not protests, but these were protests that seemed to want to cause chaos and ruckus. And more importantly, that's the kind of thing the United Kingdom is not okay with on any other occasion, damage to public property. And that's the kind of protests that these are. How come is it that none of the authorities in the United Kingdom, in their good wisdom, thought of a way to make sure that these protests don't take place again?
Yes, well, I think it's difficult for the UK to prevent the protests altogether, just because there's a big tradition here of protesting, particularly in central London. There was a lot of outrage in the Indian community at some of the rubbish and other stuff that was thrown at the embassy in those last protests, and I think they have really made a sort of a strong gesture to the UK government that they expect protection from that kind of activity, and I think they had to clean up for days after that. But I guess the UK government is caught between a rock and a hard place there, given that it is a very vibrant democracy when it comes to protests. So it is quite difficult for them to ban it altogether.
Dr. Kadira Petiogora, former visiting fellow at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy, joining us live from London. Thank you so much for being with us here on the broadcast on WION The World as well.